So far, how have we been handling errors in our servers? If there's no console logs, we're sending it, yeah. And we don't want to change that. We want to send our error to the front end if it occurs, so Axios, the promise-based mechanism we're using, can see the error and call the .catch instead of the .then. So we don't want to change this, but do we see some redundancy? Yeah, you see some redundancy. So there's got to be a way to set this up so we only really have to handle them once. And not only that, is these error objects sent by Mongoose, they're going to look a specific way. They're going to have specific properties in their object. But later in the course, we're going to be sending our own errors. You know, if something else, I'll just say 2 equals 2, doesn't matter what this is. But we'll want to set the status and then send our own error. We'll send a new error object with, an error message in it. And we may be sending back different types of error objects that will look different than the error objects sent by Mongoose. And the bad thing about that is in our .catches, on the front end, there's no consistency. One might be error.message, one might be error.response.message, or error.response.error message or something. And we want consistency. All of our errors should look the same on the front end. So what we can do, and it will require the next keyword, is we can create an error handling middleware. And that will be on our server.js. So this is the last piece of our boilerplate we need for our server setup. And it's going to be right after the routes here and before the listen. We're going to introduce a global error handler. So the request will come in and we'll hit the routes. If an error occurs, the route will forward it on to the error handler, and the error handler will send it to our front end. But all errors, regardless of where they occur, will end up going through this function. Well, if it's a middleware, what is the server method I can use to use middleware? There we go, app.use. And typically, we send an endpoint or require something. But remember, middleware, the use, has access to the rec, res, and next parameters. It's a part of the server process. So it needs to know what does the request object look like, what does the response look like, and have the ability to go next if it needs to. So this is a standard middleware. This is not an error handling middleware yet. To teach Express that this is an error handling middleware, we actually add one more parameter at the beginning, and that is error. And now Express knows this is an error handling middleware. It has to accept all 4 parameters for this to work, even though we may only use 1 or 2 of them. Okay. Well, when the error hits this, we'd like to see it in our server console, maybe in some nice red text so we can see it. So if we use console.error, it'll console log whatever we tell it to, but in red, so we can see it as an error. And so we're going to console log the error object as it comes in. So anytime an error occurs, we'll get a nice snapshot here in the console. And then we need to send it to the user. So we'll return res.send an object. And the reason we're making an object is we get to define what we call this error. In the response, when the .catch comes in, this is the object the catch is going to receive, and it's going to have certain properties we set up. So we're going to say every error message sent to the front end should be called something like error message. And that will be the errors.message. So now every .catch will have an error.response.data.error message equal to the current message on the error. And this is to handle all of the Mongoose errors. That's how they look. They have this error.message. Unfortunately, when you create your own error like this, this would be the error.message. So this is going to work for both Mongoose errors and errors that we manually create. There will be a little bit more we add to this when we get to user authentication to handle unauthorized errors. This is great. So our routes will set the status, but then instead of immediately sending the error, it's going to forward it to this error handler.
So we can delete all the other.
Can't delete it. We still have to handle it, but we don't have to send it there. We're going to forward it to here and have this send every single error so that every error makes it to the front end looking the same way. It's going to look like this object with a .error message. You can call this anything you'd like. You can call it error message if you want the whole word. I like the abbreviated, but this is just the key you're choosing to call the error message. So now how do we implement this in our routes? Well, we've already done the setup for it. Every route we have has access to the next parameter. And what does next do? Goes to the next thing in line. Well, if we call next and give it an error, let's say this error occurred and we use next on it and pass this error. It's going to check every handler and see that none of these are for handling errors. So it hits the end of the line, it jumps back to our server, it comes out of the route, keeps reading down the file, and then gets caught by the error handler. So this is where next will send the error to every time. It'll receive it, console log it, and then send it to the front end with a specific name. So now in every single route we have, instead of res.status 500 return res.send error, we're going to change res.send to next. And we're going to call next, give it the error, and return it. So it exits this function and immediately jumps down to our error handler. So instead of return res.send, we'll just say next. Next, don't change the res.send of the successful response. That needs to stay the same. But we're going to use next on all of these errors. Cool. And this is why we can't say res.status 500 dot something, because next is not a method of the response. Next is a method of our middleware. So I couldn't say dot next. That's not a thing. Dot next is not a method of response. Next is its own function. Okay, so let's see this in action. Let's actually see our error object show up now. So let's cause an error. Let's try to post something that's already been posted. So what drink do we already have? We have the Kool-Aid drink, so let's send that. Name Kool-Aid has alcohol. True. We're going to post this. The post is going to hit this request, create the new object, try to save it. Notice it's a duplicate, and forward the error to our error handler, which will receive it and actually send it back. So we'll send. And notice, what is the name of this error message? Error message. It's right here. If I didn't send this object, if I just sent the entire error, notice how this changes. Right, and different errors will have different looking objects, and we don't need this data. Sometimes we'll want some of the error object, and we can include that here where we send. But what we really need to know is what happened, because this is what we're going to use on the front end in some cases to show the user an actual error. So by sending our own object and just using the piece of the error we want, we get this consistency. Regardless of how the error occurs, we'll always get a response.data that has a .error message that we can use. That's the purpose of Global Error Handler, and that's how a really elegant way to handle errors with Express servers. One middleware function, and just using next to forward it forward. Okay, any questions on global error handling? for our backend.
So when you say error.message, there was a new place here where you have a message, but
Yeah.
so like
It still does it. It's still part of the error object, even though we weren't seeing it here. Yeah, you're right. When we sent the request and just saw the error, there is no error.message. The error object by default knows if we're asking for the dot message, it will just give us whatever the problem was. And that's why this works so consistently. So instead of getting this, we get that. Okay.